For decades, Lake Mokoan's dam was a lifeline for farmers. Then officials decided to tear it down, risking outrage and billions in water. Critics called it madness. But as the dust settled, rivers healed, vanished species reappeared, and a hidden economic windfall emerged. Why did authorities gamble everything on removing a massive reservoir, and what did nature do that nobody expected? The answer changes how we think about controlling water, and it all began with a single, controversial decision. Reports from the early 2000s painted a stark picture. Each year, Lake Mokoan lost nearly 50,000 megaliters of water, enough to supply a regional city, vanishing into thin air. The reservoir, originally designed as a drought buffer for northern Victoria, had become an open pan for evaporation. Engineers documented the figures in technical papers, noting how the shallow, sprawling surface accelerated water loss. As the Millennium Drought gripped southeastern Australia, every drop counted. Yet at Lake Mokoan, the math was inescapable. More than a quarter of the stored water disappeared before it reached farms or rivers downstream. The numbers drew scrutiny from state water authorities, and in 2003, a commissioned report flagged the dam as one of the region's most inefficient storages. The lake's vast area, sometimes stretching over 7,000 hectares, meant sunlight and wind-stripped water at a rate unmatched by deeper, smaller reservoirs. Even in average years, the annual evaporation rivaled the total water use of entire irrigation districts. This was not just a seasonal hiccup. The losses were hardwired into the dam's design. Downstream, the broken river suffered, water quality plummeted as the stagnant lake released turbid, nutrient-rich flows, sometimes pushing downstream turbidity to over 5 times the levels found upstream. Algal blooms became common, fish populations shifted as the river's natural rhythms were disrupted. Farmers and environmental scientists alike saw the warning signs, even as arguments flared over whether the dam's benefits still outweighed its mounting costs. By 2004, the inefficiency was impossible to ignore. State planners faced a dilemma: keep patching the system or find a way to stop the waste for good. Technical reviews recommended radical action, decommission the lake, return flows to the broken river, and give up on the old promise of endless water storage. And for some, it was a betrayal of decades of investment. For others, it was the only solution that made sense in an era of tightening water supplies. The evaporation figures landed on government desks just as the Millennium Drought reached its peak. The urgency was real. With reservoirs across Victoria running dry, every megaliter lost to the sky felt like a policy failure. The case for dismantling Lake Mokoan was not built on ideology or guesswork. It was anchored in hard data, painstakingly gathered and impossible to dismiss. The waste was visible, measurable, and for many, unforgivable. This was the technical logic that would soon drive one of the most controversial water decisions in Australian history. On April 20th, 2007, a single signature gave the plan its legal backbone. The Victorian Minister for Planning, acting under the Environment Effects Act of 1978, issued a formal decision. No full environmental effects statement would be required for the decommissioning of Lake Mokoan. Years of technical investigations and environmental studies had already mapped out the likely impacts. These reports showed that draining the lake would save tens of thousands of megaliters each year, restore natural flows to the broken river, and revive a wetland system that had been submerged for nearly 4 decades. The process was anything but casual. The Office of Water, alongside the Department of Sustainability and Environment, submitted detailed applications outlining every step: how the reservoir would be drawn down, how the dam wall would be breached, and how the returning water would be managed to avoid downstream flooding. Environmental management plans set strict monitoring and mitigation requirements, from sediment control to wildlife surveys. The minister's approval came only after these conditions were locked in, ensuring the project would comply with state and federal environmental protections. This was not a loophole or a rushed decree. The Environment Effects Act was designed to weigh large-scale projects against their social, economic, and ecological costs. In the case of Lake Mokoan, the evidence pointed in one direction: the net benefits of removal outweighed the arguments for keeping the dam. The minister's decision did not erase controversy, but it made the path forward legally unassailable. There would be no drawn-out court battles or last-minute reversals. The decommissioning would proceed, and the law was on its side. For many, this moment felt like the point of no return.
The approval triggered a cascade of administrative actions, contracts for civil works, community notifications, and water reallocation plans. Irrigators received notice that their entitlements would be transferred to more reliable storages further south. Local councils were briefed on the coming changes, from the loss of lakeside recreation to the promise of new wetlands. Technical teams began preparing for the controlled breaching of the dam wall, while environmental scientists mapped out baseline surveys to track the site's transformation. Behind the official paperwork, tension simmered. Farmers, anglers, and lakeside residents saw the minister's sign off as a blow to their way of life. Some accused the government of ignoring local voices in favor of distant environmental goals. Others warned that draining the lake would devastate regional tourism and property values. Yet the statutory process left little room for reversal. The decision was final, its rationale spelled out in public documents and technical appendices. The machinery of government had spoken, and the fate of Lake Mokoan was sealed. Anger boiled over in the farming districts around Lake Mokoan. News of the dam's fate spread quickly, and the reaction was immediate. For families who had relied on the reservoir since the 1970s, the prospect of losing it felt like a personal attack. Farm gates sprouted protest signs overnight. At town meetings, voices shook with frustration as irrigators demanded answers from state officials. Some farmers spoke of broken promises and threatened to chain themselves to machinery if demolition crews arrived. Others gathered in caravans, staging slow-moving convoys along the Benalla-Winton Road to make sure their objections could not be ignored. Fear was rooted in numbers. Each year, the dam supplied water for thousands of hectares of crops, lucerne, canola, and wheat. Without it, the risk of dry paddocks and failed seasons loomed large. The government's plan offered a transition. About 22,000 megaliters per year would be reallocated to irrigators from more reliable storages further south. State officials insisted this would secure supply and reduce the waste that had plagued Lake Mokoan for decades. But for the farmers who had built their livelihoods around the lake, the promise of piped water from distant reservoirs rang hollow. They worried about rising costs, longer delays, and the loss of control over when and how water reached their fields. Behind closed doors, farm groups drafted petitions and coordinated letter-writing campaigns. Local radio crackled with heated interviews. Some accused the government of sacrificing rural communities for city interests and green ideals. The Benalla Rural City Council passed formal motions of opposition, warning that draining the lake would gut property values and wipe out tourism businesses built on fishing and boating. The anger was not just economic, it was cultural. For many, Lake Mokoan had become a symbol of local identity, a place where families gathered for picnics and children learned to fish. Its loss threatened to erase decades of shared history. As the deadline approached, the sense of powerlessness grew. Farmers watched as surveyors marked out access roads for heavy equipment and contractors began assembling at the dam wall. The machinery of government moved forward, but in the paddocks and town halls, the resistance only hardened. The promise of mitigation, those 22,000 megaliters, the new pipelines, the technical briefings, did little to blunt the feeling of betrayal. The decision had been made, but on the ground the wounds were fresh and the future uncertain. Inside Parliament, the fight over Lake Mokoan turned into a political spectacle. Opposition leaders seized on the decision, branding it as reckless and out of touch with rural Australia. In heated speeches, they accused the government of bowing to environmental extremism, warning that the dam's closure would cripple farming communities and handcuff regional economies. Some members of Parliament painted the move as a city-centric agenda, designed to please environmental lobbyists at the expense of working families. They called for urgent reviews, demanded independent audits, and pressed ministers to justify every calculation behind the plan. The debates were relentless. Day after day, rural representatives pressed their case, reading letters from farmers who feared losing their livelihoods. They waved petitions and quoted local business owners, predicting the end of lakeside tourism. One member warned that draining the dam would leave entire districts vulnerable to drought, while another claimed the government was gambling with food security for the sake of ideology. Despite the uproar, the legal groundwork held firm. No lawsuits materialized. The minister's approval, issued under the Environment Effects Act, left little room for challenge. Instead, the battle played out in the court of public opinion. Headlines called it a betrayal of the bush. Talkback radio fumed with calls for resignations. Yet inside the chamber, the government stood by its technical reports, insisting the science was clear, the dam wasted more water than it saved, and the region's future depended on smarter management, not nostalgia. As the weeks dragged on, the rhetoric grew sharper. Opposition leaders accused the government of ignoring the risks of flooding, of fire, of ecological collapse. They warned that once the dam was gone, there would be no going back. The word experiment echoed through committee rooms, laced with suspicion. To critics, the decommissioning was a gamble with too much at stake. To supporters, it was a necessary break from a failed past. In the end, the controversy became a line in the sand. No compromise, no last-minute deals. The law was settled. The machinery of removal was already in motion, and the voices of dissent faded into the background. The political storm had spent itself, leaving only the question of what would happen next. When the dam was finally gone and the river ran free again, water scientists returned to the broken river with a sense of caution. They expected a long, messy recovery, years of muddied flows, stubborn nutrients, and a slow crawl back toward health. Instead, the first year delivered a surprise that rippled through technical reports and field notes alike. Turbidity readings, which had hovered around 173 NTU downstream of the old lake, fell to match the upstream baseline of 33 NTU within just 12 months. The river, once choked with suspended silt and algae, ran clear for the first time in decades. Data loggers confirmed what field crews saw with their own eyes. The sediment plume that had dogged the river's lower reaches was gone. Nutrient levels, too, began to shift. Total nitrogen and phosphorus, both elevated for years by constant lake discharges, trended downward. It took 5 years for the river's nutrient profile to fully converge with its upstream segment, but the direction was unmistakable. The river's chemistry, once warped by the artificial reservoir, was realigning with its natural state. Hydrologists noted the change in their models. Suddenly, rainfall and flow patterns mattered again, rather than the unpredictable pulses from a shallow, evaporating lake. Biotic surveys told a parallel story. Fish communities downstream of the former lake, once dominated by carp and other disturbance-tolerant species, began to resemble the more balanced populations upstream. Native fish, including sport species prized by anglers, showed signs of resurgence. Vegetation along the riverbanks responded as well. Littoral zones long submerged or battered by fluctuating water levels saw the return of rushes and sedges. Wetland mosaics reformed in the place of open water, activating long dormant seed banks and creating habitat for birds and amphibians. The speed of recovery caught even seasoned ecologists off guard. Instead of a drawn-out, intervention-heavy process, the river and wetlands began to heal themselves as soon as the artificial pressure was lifted. The evidence was plain in the numbers and in the return of life to a landscape many had written off. Nature, given a single chance, did something few had dared to predict. A decade ago, few would have bet on a positive economic story emerging from the dismantling of Lake McCowan. Yet, as water returned to the broken river and the Winton wetlands began to take shape, the numbers started telling a different story, one that reached far beyond local headlines. Water managers tracked the reallocation of 44 gigaliters per year, a volume valued at over 1.2 billion Australian dollars across a 10-year span. This wasn't just a technical fix for river health, it was a windfall that rippled through the entire Murray-Darling Basin, delivering reliable flows to the Goulburn, Snowy, and Murray rivers. Tourism, once written off by critics as collateral damage, quietly rebounded. The new wetlands became a magnet for birdwatchers, cyclists, and school groups, drawing in an estimated $35 million annually. Local businesses adapted, cafes and accommodation shifted their pitch from lakeside boating to eco-adventure and education. The Winton Wetlands Visitor Center opened its doors, hosting thousands each year and providing a new anchor for regional tourism. The real surprise came from the global stage. Environmental engineers and policy analysts began citing the Lake McCowan project in international forums, studying how a region could pivot from engineered storage to restored wetland
without economic collapse. Delegations from Europe, North America, and Asia sent observers to Victoria, eager to understand the mechanics behind the transition. Reports circulated through water policy circles highlighting the paradox. By giving up control and letting nature reclaim a man-made reservoir, Australia had gained more than it lost. The water savings, the revived wetlands, and the steady stream of visitors combined to create a model that defied the warnings of economic ruin. Instead, the numbers pointed to a turnaround that few had seen coming, and that other countries now hoped to replicate. Across Australia, over 500 dams now face scrutiny for their impact on ecosystems and water security. As droughts intensify and biodiversity collapses threaten billions in economic losses, the debate shifts from restoring what was lost to reimagining what is possible. Nature's response to bold decisions is not always predictable, but it is never silent. The next gamble will define the landscapes we leave behind. Share your thoughts on what future you would choose.